Hi, this is Kelly, and you're listening to Reading Between the Legs. This is honest talk on sex, health, and soul. So, today I had an amazing interview with Emi Canahuati. She's a sexuality educator, trainer, and coach, and also a certified positive discipline parent educator. She also has her own business called Talk and Thrive Education. She'll talk a lot more to you about that here in a bit. I just honestly want to jump right into this interview. This episode's a little bit longer, but I really didn't want to cut out any more of this interview than I had to. We really had an amazing talk, I think, and I really hope you guys enjoy this. Please give me some feedback. Let me know what you think. And like I said, I'm just going to jump right into the interview. So here we go. All right. So I have Emi here with me. Emi, can you just kind of tell me what your title is and what your job right now consists of?
Yeah. So my name is Emi Canahuati, and I'm a sexuality educator, trainer, and coach, and a positive discipline parent educator. So I like to say I do a lot of things parenting. Basically. I have my own business called Talk and Thrive Education. And mainly I work with parents on how to have conversations comfortably around sex and sexuality because, people are concerned about people only like to think of people as sexual beings when they're adults, and or adolescents, I suppose. But in fact, it starts much earlier, right? We're sexual beings from the time that we're born till the time that we die. Whether we're having sex or not, how we express that is so varied. And so I always, the way I kind of put it is sexually healthy children turn into sexually healthy adolescents who turn into sexually healthy adults.
100%.
Don't have those scaffolding underneath, then it's a lot easier to kind of fall through the cracks and to have a lot of gaps. And what I find is so many people, when they get to adulthood and even adolescence as well, run into so many roadblocks and pain and difficulties and lack of information and education. And so really my main goal is to get parents and the world to really understand the importance of nurturing healthy sexuality from the time the children are young, so that you can build from there. It's so much easier to prevent things than it is to, fix and band-aid them afterwards. But I think as a culture, Western culture doesn't seem to believe in that overall.
Yeah, no, and I wish we had you everywhere. Which I
Yeah.
think we do. I mean, we do have people like this everywhere. It's
Yes, there
because it's
are lots
something
of,
we
yeah,
struggle with, and I struggle with my job constantly is trying to teach prevention and how
yeah,
do we talk to our children about this in an appropriate way. And there's so many barriers. I
indeed.
guess before we get to all of that, what other experiences do you have? Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I have a background in counseling and psychology. I thought I was telling you that thought I wanted to be a therapist, and I am so grateful and so respect and in awe of the work that therapists do. But what I realized is that I think that my skills and fortes are better used on the prevention side of things than they are on the other side of the helping side of things. Yeah, that was just much more of a call to me. Um, I've worked with Planned Parenthoods around the country with different affiliates. I've worked around youth development. I'm currently now working at a school um, to do sex ed in the classroom for 9 through 14-year-olds, and doing parent workshops around sexuality communication and also positive discipline.
Awesome. Awesome. Why do you have any clue why you chose like sex ed or reproductive health education as this? I mean, was there like a calling to you to do this? Or feel like you struggled with this as a child yourself and so you felt like it was more important when you like grew up or
Yeah, that's Yeah, that's always the interesting piece, right? Like I think that as a adolescent, I definitely struggled, but more around with body issues and
Hmm.
puberty and self-esteem stuff. I wouldn't necessarily say there were a lot of struggles around sexuality, but when I think about where my passion for this comes, it really is about helping young people really understand that what they're going through is normal and it's okay, and that they can talk with somebody about it, and that they don't have to go through it alone or in pain. um, that's part of the quote unquote suffering that I want to relieve with making adults be resources for young people. I
Yes.
don't think I particularly was able to, my I would say my parents and my upbringing was, neutral to positive overall. But there were little things like, when I was 15, I had a boyfriend, and I was really making decisions about whether, what I wanted to do sexually or how far I wanted to go. And I remember asking my mother, Mom, did you have sex before you got married? And her response to me was, "That's really none of your business," which was not actually a common response for my mom among things. Generally, she was willing to talk about them, but this is just one of those things, I guess, that caught her. And really, I use that as an example with parents to talk about what a missed opportunity that was, because it really actually wasn't me wanting, a breakdown of her sexual history before she got married to my dad. It was really about, I was trying to make decisions for myself. And you look to your parents, right? If you
Yes.
have generally healthy parents and they're available, you'll like, okay, well, how did you figure this out, kind of thing. So, just to illustrate to parents about the importance of what's the question behind the question. When children ask questions, try to figure out what is it they're actually asking. And so that's yeah, I would say that that's the thing that drives me.
Awesome.
That
Awesome.
lights the
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah. That's really, I think, and I talked about this a lot in my last episode. I talked a lot about how, we have, because really my goal is to make sure that all children have access to sex ed, whether it's
Yeah,
from their parents or in a different venue, because not
yep,
everybody has that parental role model.
that's right.
We have kids that have parents that have drug problems, or parents that are alcoholics, or parents that work 4 or 5 jobs to keep the lights on,
Yep,
or kids that live in foster care and move home to home to home. So it's not always, I mean, that was my biggest drive here, is just how do I reach people that don't have that role model.
right.
But I think that there's a lot of parents out there that don't feel comfortable. This is why we need programs like what you're doing, because we
Yeah,
have parents that have no clue what they're talking
yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. It falls into
Do
that.
you see that a lot? Like parents
Oh,
that have
yeah.
no idea?
It's Yeah, so much of it is fear and discomfort, and oftentimes shame over people's own experiences. There's so much trauma and sexual abuse in people's backgrounds, and that will absolutely color whether you approach this with your children or not. And unfortunately, not everyone has had access to be able to have some healing around those experiences. And we know that sexual abuse, we have an absolute epidemic of it, and it continues. And those are, core wounds in so many different ways, and it absolutely impacts how we experience our sexuality and our bodies and relationships. And that's what's going around. The kids the kids at the school that I teach at, they they said, I was saying something about, you have to realize that you're getting more sex ed than the average, student, particularly here in Tennessee where I'm based,
Yeah.
because we're an abstinence only
Yeah.
abstinence only state. And she said, "Yeah, this school is weird." This was a 9-year-old who said that. She goes, "Yeah, this school is weird for doing this." And I was like, "Actually, other schools are weird for not doing it." I
Yeah.
said, "This should be the mainstream. This should be the way things are done. But unfortunately, it's not the case.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I've done a lot of research, and I did a paper on this as well about sex education in other countries, and how it's just like a norm for some of these countries that
Yeah.
they just do comprehensive sex ed, and they start it at the age of like 6. It's something that's just included in their education throughout, K through 12 or whatever. And I really think, yeah, it's funny she said that, because no, you're really lucky actually that you're getting
Yeah.
this.
It shouldn't be that way.
You are going to grow up to be hopefully a much healthier adult when it comes to knowing your body and what's normal and all those kinds of things. So that's funny. Share with me a little bit about like your experience with comprehensive sex ed, and maybe like what barriers have you reached with that as well?
Yeah. Well, it's such a big question, right?
I know.
I guess, well, maybe what might be useful is, like, what have you already talked about in terms of that? And maybe if I've encountered something different, I could add to it.
So really, it's just women understanding what's normal, what's not normal for their
Mhm.
body,
Yep.
um, things that they should be doing as far as, I mean, one of the silly things is just how to clean their genital area.
Yep.
I mean,
Absolutely.
it's like they think that things should smell like roses,
Yep.
but actually using those kinds of products makes things 10 times worse.
Yep.
So, I mean, it really is just very simple things like that that I run into pretty much on a daily basis.
Yep.
And also just young girls not understanding that sex can happen. I mean, pregnancy can happen, or an STD can happen immediately. Like, it doesn't have to be 10 times having sex. It can
Yeah.
happen the very first time.
Yeah.
I've had 17-year-olds, their first sexual encounter, have herpes, and them
Yeah.
just being completely blown away. But I feel like nobody ever told her, and I'll never forget that girl, but I feel like just nobody ever told her, hey, this can happen. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest things that I've really encountered, and I think that I've talked the most about so far.
Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, you have legislators, mostly men, making decisions based on a lack of scientific basic education.
Yes.
Saying things like, um, women who are raped can shut a pregnancy down. Um, uh, this wasn't a legislator, but this was some man saying something like, I don't understand why you need menstrual products. Can't you just stop, menstruating whenever you want? And so we can trace a direct lack of education um, to decisions that are made by lawmakers that affect people's lives. All of these abortion bans around, at the first heartbeat, and when, like, reversing abortions, and it's just like, what in the world are you talking about? Like, you don't even live in this in a factual world. And so these have real world implications for
Yes.
people's lives and health. And you know I unfortunately, I think we trace a lot of it back to shame, around sex and sexuality in general, people being shamed for their desires, behaviors, etc. How many people, like, I feel like it's on a weekly basis we get news programs about people who used to do conversion therapy, or who led this organization that was rabidly anti-LGBT, comes out as gay, or they find out they're gay. And
Yeah.
it's just like, oh my goodness, like, can we stop the shaming? But sexuality is scary. Women's sexuality is scary. My my total conspiracy theory, because I don't know that I have factual basis for this. Um, this fear of women's sexuality of because of most, most people with vulvas, with their, or people with clitorises, I guess more directly, their ability to have multiple orgasms. It's like this, this perceived maybe insatiability, and men's fear that they can't satiate a woman somehow relates to, like, let's shut this down. Let's make sure that women don't know about pleasure and can't access it and feel ashamed about it. And everybody gets hurt. Everybody gets hurt.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's it's so far reaching. Um,
My husband
you
will
know,
love
uh,
my husband will love that that conspiracy theory you have, actually.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's
good.
fantastic. He's 100% all about conspiracy theories.
Yeah,
So he will
I'm
he will
usually not, but that's my one
yeah,
indulgence.
I love it.
Um, yeah, it pleasure. The concept of pleasure, and if we can call it American culture, but just being able, being allowed to access it, and allowing women access to their own bodies. And it's just it's so big. I'm like, I
It
can keep
is.
coming up with 1,700 things,
I know.
that are problematic.
Well, and the thing that I'm seeing happening right now, in my biggest struggle, and this has been around for decades and decades, but we have this hard time separating church and state. So, there's so many people that have beliefs that you shouldn't have sex until you're married, and I'm okay with that. I'm totally 100% okay with you believing that that's how it should be. But our issue is that, so we're saying that we should be doing abstinence only education out there. And so this is my biggest struggle with yeah, with sex ed, is just that, well, not everybody believes that. And so what about the people that don't have those beliefs? And also, is that really reality? Because I know that's not reality.
It's not.
But I
Yeah,
know we want to, as parents, and I'm not a parent, but
yeah,
I talk to parents all the time. They want to believe that
yeah.
that's what their children will do. So they
Right.
think that, okay, well, we don't need to talk about it then, because they're not going to get diseases if everybody only has sex until they're married. Well, yeah, okay. But I mean,
Yeah,
what kind of dream world are we living in that you think that that's real and that's actually going to happen? I think that's what really, really, yeah, it just drives my mind insane. I
yeah,
don't I can't actually understand people that think that way, to be honest.
yeah,
So it's hard for me.
yeah. No, I have a really hard time too. Uh, I don't. It's funny. I don't. Surprisingly, especially where I live, like, and I think it's one of those. You just, people who call me are already on some sort of path of, like, okay, I know I need to do this. So
Yes.
don't actually get a tremendous amount of pushback from the people that I end up talking to. I know there is a lot of pushback, particularly in the South, in this area, but I don't get it because I think, again, once somebody calls me, a parent calls me, they want, I have a group of parents and there's this issue and they need to talk about it. And so they'll call me in, or a school, says, hey, can you come talk to our parents about this? Like, there's already kind of a sort of a buy-in. Um, so I don't get to practice my, counterpoints a lot necessarily. But one of the things one of the main arguments around sex ed is, a lot of parents say they want to be able to do this. And even not even from necessarily a religious standpoint, often it is. There's a big overlap there, I have seen, but sometimes it's not even from that, but they say they want to do it. And I was like, great, let's do it. Let's talk about how you can do that. What tools do you need in order to be able to have this conversation, with this ongoing conversation with your child. One of the things I talk to parents about, and professionals, and maybe you can corroborate this in your training, most medical folks, as well as mental health folks, almost get no training in sexuality. Zero.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe an hour. I've heard anywhere from 0 to 11 hours of training, depending on what you're doing. I suppose if you're in OB-GYN or if you're specifically, in reproductive health, then yes, you get more. But unless you do that, you're really not getting a lot.
No, because in nursing school, I got like hardly anything. It was only that specific, like the human sexuality class that I took that I really learned so much more about human sexuality.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it gets siloed.
Yeah.
And so it's like only if you dig into it can you see that it's there. But otherwise, and that's just how we treat sexuality in general, right?
Yeah.
We're supposed to be non-sexual, except for the part where women are supposed to be sexy all the time, but then they're asking for it, and so then they get assaulted, but then it's their fault. It's like, really, help me out here.
And we wonder why our children are so confused. There's so many mixed
Yeah.
messages out there. My goodness. Oh, I could just talk about that for hours too. Whew.
Yeah, no, we can.
Yeah.
All kinds of tangents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I read I was doing some research and reading some studies, and there's so many studies out. Well, not so many, actually, there's not really that many, but the ones that I read about where are kids getting their sex education. Yeah. I mean, less than half of them in a lot of the studies were saying their parents.
Yep.
One of the studies I read, 75% of them said that friends were the first people they learned about it from. So, I mean, right there, yeah, we want to say that that they should be getting this information from their parents, but it's not happening, or they're not getting the correct information.
Or enough, the studies that show that when they ask a parent and their teen, like you ask the teen, how much, or you ask the parent, like, how much do you think you're talking about sexuality to your child? Oh, a lot. And you ask their teen, how much is your parent talking to you? Oh, almost none. It's like that Woody Allen movie.
Yeah.
I hate to bring him into this, but yeah. That's the scene that I remember.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's, parents think they're talking about it a lot, and teens don't feel that way. And they're just kind of floundering out there with with a lot of misinformation that you end up, seeing the results of, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And there's no reason for it. There's just no reason.
Yeah. What do you feel like are the biggest topics that are missing, like either in our sex education programs in schools? Although, I mean, that can range, I know, but I mean, what do you feel like you get the most from parents that they feel like they need to talk more about, or they need to learn more about?
Well, the thing that consistently teens ask for when they're asked about, like, what do you need, is really a lot more guidance around relationships. And that doesn't necessarily just mean romantic relationships, right? But friendships as well, and communication, and how do you deal with hurts and rejection and that kind of thing. Like, I think on some level, like the progression that I see is the following. It's like parents, if they're aware, they have some sense of, like, okay, I want to help prevent sex abuse. So maybe the first thing that these kids hear is, oh, take care of your genitals. Somebody might try and touch you and hurt you. Then maybe they're starting to get to puberty. Maybe they'll get some information about that. Maybe people who menstruate might get some information about that, hopefully. Then the next thing they might hear is, don't get pregnant, don't get somebody pregnant. That's the second message, is even less so, right? And then, well, save it until you get married. It's, it's awful, dirty, terrible, save it for the one you love, kind of thing. And that's a very skeleton view of what I think most people get. And then you mix in some porn education, some misinformation from their friends, and this is where we end up, basically. So you have people, with terrible relationship skills, terrible communication skills. And I see it now with my daughter, who's about to turn 12. So much of the work at this age developmentally is literally about How do you manage relationships? How do you deal with hurts? How do you communicate needs and feelings and emotions? And how do you do that respectfully? And if parents aren't able, if they can't model that on top of that, parents are caregivers, right? First of all, you have to be able to model that. So that means you can't give what you don't have, right? Like
Yes.
some of the things that my daughter struggles with that I used to struggle with as a teen, like I still struggle with, like, okay, I'm not quite sure how to help you out with that because I didn't have the wherewithal, and it's still difficult and complicated. And so, it really takes a lot of work, and a lot of parents don't have the access, the time, the money, to be able to take the the luxury of acquiring that knowledge and skills that we didn't get when we were younger. And so you get stuck, and your children get stuck.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to me that and even I have this problem when I talk about sex ed, because my focus is always so much on preventing STDs and
Yeah,
pregnancy,
yeah,
and I don't think so much about communication. But if you really think about the big picture of human sexuality, communication is part of that, because if we
it's
don't
the
communicate with
foundation.
each other about, hey, when
Yep,
was the last time you were tested? Are you
yep.
on birth control? Did you bring a
Did you use a
condom? Are you,
condom? Yep, that's exactly
yes.
right.
Yeah,
And
very
consent.
simple questions. Yes. Are
Yeah,
you okay with what's going on right now? I mean, I feel like the word consent is being misused a little right now, just because of all the Me Too movement and
yeah,
all of this. We're almost making a joke out of it, like, oh, can I touch your arm? Like, I feel
yeah.
like it's almost being, played as like a joke right now. But consent is so important, and it's something we need to talk about and teach our children how, even as little kids,
That's
how they
right.
need to ask for consent, and they should be able to give it. So
Yep.
I think I actually saw something you posted on your Facebook page recently about that, about children giving consent at a very young age. And I read the article. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, giving and receiving consent. I mean, it's a basic skill. One of the things I'm trying to, a couple of things I'm trying, as I've been in this field now for about 20 years. Like, we've generally in this country, the core of sex ed has been what we call disaster prevention, right? Let's
Yes.
prevent an STD or an STI and a pregnancy, an unplanned pregnancy, right?
Yes.
And then everything else flows out from that. That's the lens. And that's a very narrow lens. It was the lens that I used when I first started in my career for a very long time. But in fact, if we made pleasure the core of sex ed and sexuality, and everything flowed from that, you would eliminate so many of the negative outcomes and experiences that happen in sex ed. Because if mutual pleasure is the core, then that means certainly an STD is not going to happen, because that's not pleasurable for anybody, right?
Yeah.
An unplanned pregnancy is not part of pleasure. But then you can bring in things like consent, and are you liking what's happening or not, or what would you like more of or less of? What if, how can we can have and give pleasure without sex, that so it expands the behaviors that people can engage in. Knowledge about your own body and other people's bodies and how to access that. So it just becomes a completely different lens from which to look at sex ed. And then the other thing, when I talk to older teens about this stuff, I'll what I've been trying to promote is an ethos of, if what are the characteristics that you would love to be present in any shared sexual encounter that you have, right? What's your bottom line? And so have them think about that, and again, have everything flow from that. So what I've suggested, is like, what about if every single encounter that you had included pleasure, mutuality, and joy, and responsibility, right? What if every single encounter included that? How would that change your view, what you do, what you say, what you ask for? Like how revolutionary would that be?
I know a lot of adults that need to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
So, but if we can get teens, and young people there, then hopefully they bring that into their adult experiences and relationships.
Yeah. Man, I wish I would have heard that when I was 20.
Yeah.
Seriously,
Oh, I
even,
know. So many things that I've learned now. I'm like, oh, yeah,
yeah.
this would have been helpful when I was 15. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because I just didn't have that support at all. I mean, my mother is fantastic, and her and I have talked about this now. And,
Yeah.
she was raised
Yep.
in a generation where it was taboo and it wasn't something to be discussed. And so that's how I was raised.
Yep.
And I discussed this in my last episode. I was raised in the Catholic Church as well. So it just, nothing was ever about pleasure. It was about, well, you only have sex to have children,
Yeah.
and that it shouldn't be pleasurable. And
Yeah.
pleasure that
At
you
least
get
not for
from,
one person.
yes, exactly. And, and the pleasure it shouldn't be about pleasure. It should only be about reproduction.
Right.
And if you feel pleasure, it's, you should feel guilty about it. And so
Yep.
I think that changing that, and once again, people are allowed to have their own beliefs, and I'm okay with that. But everybody, we all need to understand that our bodies were made to have pleasure. So
Yep.
it's an okay thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I was not raised in any kind of religious household. So it's sometimes a language I don't speak, but there are actually a lot of people who do speak that language of spirituality and religion, and can come at it from a very sex positive perspective. And by sex positivity, I know some people, I've seen many definitions and many ways of approaching it, but I look at sex positivity as really accepting that we are sexual beings, and that sexuality has a potential to be a great and positive force and joyful force in our lives, but it only has the potential for it. It also has the potential for a lot of potential hurt. And embracing that. So it's not, for me, it's not really about, sex positivity isn't about like, well, you get to do whatever you want, and I'm totally fine with it. I'm also, that includes my definition, but that's not the main lens that I see sex positivity through.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about in other countries, they start very early
Yeah.
discussing sexuality and things like that with children. What age do you recommend, when you speak with parents, what age do you really recommend that they start discussing sexuality with their children?
Yeah. So that's always a good question. And that's always the question of parents, right? Like, that's one of the most common questions. So I always say, actually, the first um, the first messages we send that are about sexuality are touch and physical affection. And infants, the way they start to understand whether the world is a safe and nurturing place, or it's a place that's going to hurt them and neglect them, is through touch. How much do we touch infants? How much do we hold them? The whole infant relationship with caregiver, whether it's mother or whoever, has the potential to be very sensual. And by that, I mean the senses. There's lots of physical touch. There's lots of smells. There's lots of tastes. There's not so much sight at the beginning, but within like a week to 10 days, babies can see a lot better. But there's lots of senses, and all of those help to contribute to Like, how do you relate with the world outside your body, right? And when you think about touch, when you get to be an adult or when you start having shared sexual experiences, that's such a key part of sexuality, of our experience of sexuality. And so, um, what are our experiences with touch? You know, is touch pleasurable and loving, or is it hurtful and neglectful? So that starts when you're an infant, right?
Yeah.
And then from then on, it goes with like, what words do you use for genitals? Are you using proper words, or are you using, whatever family or traditional cultural words that you've been taught? And that will influence how you feel about your body, and about those quote unquote those parts in particular. And then, are you forced to give hugs and kisses to people that you don't want to do that to? So again, bodily autonomy. Do I have power and control over my body, or do I have to do what adults tell me with my body because what I want isn't important or wanted? When I am getting tickled, if I say stop, does the other person stop? Right? So those are all messages about sexuality. And then on top of that, you layer that, how are the people talking to each other around me, right? We are born with a neuron system, with a mirror neuron system in our bodies to basically mirror people's emotions, emotional states, and facial expressions. That's why we yawn when others yawn, and why babies imitate faces and caregivers. This is why they cry when other babies cry. It's that mirror neuron system. So if there's a lot of tension, anxiety, hurt around this baby, that's going to get transferred into them, or that gets mirrored by them. It's how we learn empathy, is through the mirror neuron system. So
Yeah.
So there's all this stuff that's going on way before we even get to puberty, which is when people start to think that kids are sexual beings, right?
Yeah.
How do we react when children put their hands down their pants? What do we do when we find two children exploring their bodies? How do we react to that? What messages do we send around that? What bodily functions? How do we react to poop and pee? Right? Those are, that's part of the body. It's certainly, they share organs with our sexual organs. So those all get influenced by those kinds of experiences. There's a lot happening around age 3 is when children really start getting a sense of their gender identity, right? We think that sexual orientation, as far as we know, the best science that we have up until now tells us that sexual orientation is probably determined before we're born or very early in life. And it's really not something we can change. We can change our behavior, but we can't really change our feelings, that internal sense of who it is we're attracted to. Although I've started to put a caveat on that the last 5 years or so, where we really are finding out that our sexual orientation is much more fluid than we have tended to think. Certainly, that this idea that even though we might identify as one particular sexual orientation, like someone who might identify as heterosexual primarily for their whole lives, all of a sudden runs into this one person who's their same sex, and they're like, holy cow, you're my person, and I didn't even know that. So there's just so many points at which we can either damage or nurture our children's sexual development from a very early age. And then if you insert trauma on top of that, it just, obviously that gets complicated so much more, right? So the answer to when should we start is infancy. But really oftentimes what I find with that question that parents have is like, well, when do I need to tell my kid about how most babies are made and born?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we put so much around, okay, when do we have the talk? When it's really so much more than just what's coming out of our mouths. It's also what we're doing. And like you're saying, like how we are interacting and how we react to our children. But I know I hear a lot from I hear it from parents, the patients that I take care of. What age do I need to start talking about this stuff? So
So I would say with that, just think about like consent, body parts. Can you use proper names and give positive messages around those body parts? Not shameful, not fearful, not bad or dirty. Um, you know but I do give parents, I suggest a deadline for having that specific explicit conversation of how most babies are made, because not all babies are made through what we call PVI, penis vagina intercourse. Babies are made other ways, but I actually, no matter how that particular baby was made or all of those different ways, we still need to have that explicit conversation, because that sets the tone for whether you can have other conversations. That's your first hump, pun intended,
Yeah.
that you need to get over in order for you to be able to move on. And it is one of the hardest ones. It seems that way, but in fact, it's actually a very easy, straightforward conversation, because it's, A, B, C, D, E kind of thing. It's the ones that come after, but that you will not be able to have if you haven't had this conversation, because it's about helping train the parents and the caregivers to have it's more about the parent than it is really about the child. But around age 8, 9, 10, depending on the child's development, if a child hasn't had any significant trauma in their lives beforehand, what happens is they developmentally change in terms of their brain, where they stop kind of trying to absorb everything around them, where it's like they're open, everything is potential before that age. They're sponges, right?
Yes.
Tell me about the world, I want to learn. Then around 8, 9, 10, they start closing down. They're like, okay, moving toward pre-adolescence kind of thing. They literally start pruning the neural connections in their brains about the things that they don't need, that they haven't used up until that point. They're going to start pruning those, because the brain starts to specialize. And part of what happens is a much more self-consciousness, much more awkwardness, much more closing down of, I don't want to talk about this. If you haven't created that bridge, it's just going to be a harder bridge to cross after that age. It is not impossible. It just means expect to get more pushback from your child if you haven't had that conversation. And the thing that I always recommend to people is, like, get these 2 books. This will help. It literally, like, you don't even have to look at your child while you're while you're reading them. You can read them side by side. It literally gives you the words. And so if you can get over your own discomfort and shame, know that you're doing something good for your child. So the 2 books that I always recommend for young children is Roby Harris's book, It's Not the Stork. And that series, she has a series of 3 books that starts with It's Not the Stork. And Corey Silverberg's book, How to Make a Baby. That one is much more, it's less gender binary, more inclusive. It just really more talks about the science kind of in a childlike way. Like, it's very accessible for young children. I like to include both books because Roby Harris's book is fantastic. And it's also more on the binary side, on the gender binary side of things. So using both books together, I think, can be a really amazing tool to start having these conversations. Again, it gives you the language you need, so you don't have to be like, I don't know what to say. You just read the book. There's super lovely illustrations, super fun. There's a bird and a bee, and they're always arguing. It's like the cutest. The book is, I think it's called It's Not the Stork, a book about bodies, birth, and babies, or something like that. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I found a book at one of the other clinics I worked at, the family planning clinic I worked in. And most of it, and it really is talking from, age, and I can't even remember the name of it now, but I literally think it's called Talking to Your Children About Sex or something like that. I mean, it's very straightforward. But what they focus on so much in that book, and I think this is so important, is for parents understanding their own bias and
Yep.
understanding their own thoughts, beliefs,
Yep.
their own, what are they uncomfortable with?
Yep.
What are they uncomfortable talking about? So if you understand your own bias, and I think this is in teaching anybody, well, as a teacher, and what I've
Yep.
learned in having to teach sex to people is I have to understand my own biases. So
Yep.
parents have to do that too.
Yep.
You have to
Absolutely.
understand where you are before you can tell somebody else about it.
Absolutely.
Because if you're going to do it in the correct way, you have to be able to filter your biases a little bit.
Yep.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Totally.
Uh,
1,000%.
yeah. So, and I want to touch on one thing that you said, because I think that this is something I try to use the word vagina as much as I possibly can, because
Yeah.
you talked a little bit about taboo around words and
Yeah.
how we have to stop that at an early age, instead of using the words like pee-pee for a penis or, whatever. I I'll never forget a patient I had that called her vagina her pocketbook. I think
Yep.
that's what it was.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah,
That
it's
is
like
such
a
a common.
list of things I can think of that people use as their words as adults. This woman was like in her 50s.
Yep.
So,
Well, and so what I like to remind parents about is that if for no other reason, it's sexual abuse prevention. A child who said to her teacher, so and so grabbed my pocketbook, and the teacher saying, "You're in first grade, you don't have a pocketbook."
oh my
And
gosh.
that is literally putting your child in danger because they do not have the words that they need in order to keep themselves safe.
Awesome.
So it is, or my other friend, this happened to a friend of mine. His mother had told him his penis was his noodle. And so he's at school, and his teacher said, something about use your noodle to figure something out. So what does he do? He pulls out his penis.
Oh no.
And guess what happened? Like, he got in trouble.
Of
And
course.
it's like, what are we doing? I found, especially since I've started to do this positive discipline parent education. I found that so much of what we deal with our children, so much of it has to do with our own stuff. That kids have probably been the same from the start of time, but the ones who change are the parents and the adults and the culture around them. But kids are being kids, you know, and it's up to us about how we can help, you know, what direction we want to go in. I have parents who are like, I'm just going to send them to you when this comes up. I was like, no, that's not what I want. I want you to do this work.
Yes,
Not
100%.
me. Yeah. So we
100%.
always say, I think, our job is to try and put ourselves out of business. But unfortunately, the way things have gone and are going, that doesn't look to be the case anytime
Yeah, honey, no, I don't think you're going out of business anytime soon. Same with me. I'm not. Nope,
Yeah.
never. So,
And of course, by business, I mean not making a lot of money, if any.
no,
So,
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
yeah.
Awesome. All right, Emmy. So, I mean, I feel like you and I could talk all day,
Yeah.
but I don't think my listeners will want to listen to like 2 hours of stuff at once. So I guess, is there anything else that you would like to touch on with like just sex education
Yeah.
or reproductive education programs or whatever? I mean, I feel like we've kind of touched on a lot of things. So,
Yeah, I would just give parents. So those two books that I mentioned are really for parents to read with their children or have their children read them. But I would say for parents, kind of touching on what you talked about kind of dealing with your own biases and your own stuff. I would recommend two books. One is called Sex Smart by Aileen Zolbrod. And it basically kind of takes you through and helps you think about sort of your early childhood experiences around sex and sexuality, including those that were traumatic. Just kind of helps you kind of frame those a little bit. And then a book called Talk to Me First: How to Be Your Child's Go-To Person to Talk About Sex, and by Deborah Rothman. I recommend those two books for parents. Those are for parents to kind of help frame, their thinking about how to approach this stuff. Because I find parents need both of those. The only other thing I will say, this is a very common concern for parents, which is what, how, if I tell my child this stuff, what if they go and tell it to their friends? And I say, that's a distinct possibility. You can try and frame it for your child around, I'm sharing this with you because I think it's important and I want us to be able to have these conversations, but every family gets to decide how their children get this information. So it's better if you don't share it. That may or may not work, and like you said, if teens' main source of information is their friends, then, kind of the jokingly way I put it is like, well, I kind of hope my child is spreading good information and rumors than bad.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
I mean, if they're getting information from somebody that knows what they're talking about,
Right,
then that's
that'd be
good.
better. Yeah. But I always say, like, that happens, and if a parent kind of comes at you with like, your child told my child, I just be like, I'm really sorry. My child hears things that I wish he didn't have to hear also. I'm sorry that happened. There's really nothing else you can say. You get to choose how you parent your child.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for reaching out, Kelly. I really appreciate it. It's been
Yeah,
fun.
of course, Emi. Thank you so much. Have a good day, hon.
We'll talk later.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye. So, what an amazing interview. I really hope you all enjoyed that. And like I said earlier, just make sure you give me some feedback and we will chat later. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.